Optical illusions can even convince us of something that our brains tells us can't possibly be happening, yet the purity and fidelity of our senses tell us otherwise. The Ukrainian then shows us this common image and tells us that this is actually a rock formation formed by magma rising from the Earth's crust and cooling into the shape we see today. He again asks the viewer, "Do you think I'm out of my mind? You're saying that this isn't a tree stump in a bed of daisies?" Let's take a look at what you call trees for just a moment. We then see a number of images of trees, and the Ukrainian goes on to reiterate that these are not in fact trees. He mentions ancient fairy tales that describe what he calls fairy forests, and asks, where are all the fairy forests we heard so much about so many years ago? He next shows us a montage of images from the late 1800s when Americans traveled west and began clearing lumber. The trees he shows us are immense. The kind you really don't find anymore, at least not in the United States. He goes on to say that this makes no sense, that the effort and danger of bringing down trees of this size would be, or would have been, counterproductive, and they would have gotten much more lumber if they'd targeted smaller, easier to manage trees. The Ukrainian likens these images to those of crime scenes, but he also states that he forgives these men for cutting down such massive trees because they weren't the ones who decided to do so, but rather the lumber barons they worked for, or perhaps persons of even higher stature. He goes on to say that, strangely, a handful of large sequoias were allowed to survive the slaughter, and that these remnants of actual forests are now euphemistically called national parks. He states that this is all that remains, at least in the United States, of the so-called fairy forests of old. He then shows us ice flows from the pole, and mentions that many scientists have commented that there does seem to be way too much ice in these parts of the world. Too much water, frozen, just sitting there, waiting to be melted. He then asks, why is all this water here? What is its function and purpose? In another seemingly schizophrenic leap of subject matter, he begins to show us fossilized and petrified creatures and objects, and mentions the ancient stories of men and animals turning into stone. He says we have examples of all sorts of animals being turned to stone through this process, and asks, but where are all the trees? Incidentally, he also mentions how Egyptian artifacts were found in the Grand Canyon, another so-called national park. He then shows us another national park, the Petrified Forest National Park, and says, here are your trees. But the Ukrainian balks at these images, saying that they've been staged. He points out the precisely cut logs seen here, and states that he would love to know what kind of saw made those cuts into basically rock, particularly in ancient times. Just as an aside, I'd like to point out that the petrification process doesn't necessarily take millions of years. People have found petrified objects as young as that of our American Civil War. The Ukrainian then once again shows us his mesa, and reiterates that this structure was caused by molten forces of rock that was melted down and then cooled in such a way as to create this shape. He asks rhetorically, "Don't believe me?" What about now? He then shows us images of Devil's Tower in Wyoming. This is where the penny drops and the video's point becomes clear. The Ukrainian shows us images taken from Devil's Tower where we can clearly see the hexagonal shafts that comprise the tower. Hexagonal shapes, incidentally, are formed by biological activity. They're nature's way of maximizing strength and content volume. They are produced by animals such as bees and are also present in the stems of many plants. We can see that there is a great deal of rubble surrounding Devil's Tower, and this has exposed the hexagonal shafts. He goes on to state that these shafts are not fused together and that there is space between them. If someone were to walk around on top of Devil's Tower, they may very well find themselves falling in between them. People nonetheless have climbed Devil's Tower, which can be treacherous, as the shafts have been known to break away from the rest of the bundle. You can also see what appear to be fossilized membranes still coating the shafts. The membranes erode and fall away, exposing the hole. Let's pause now and just consider what it would mean if Devil's Tower were in fact a massive, petrified tree stump. What would the tree have looked like? How tall would it have been? The Ukrainian states in the video that, based on his math, the tree would be somewhere in the neighborhood of 3.5 miles tall. Needless to say, just one tree like this would significantly alter the atmosphere of the surrounding area, changing the ratios of oxygen to nitrogen. The Ukrainian then goes on to say that Devil's Tower is not alone. He then shows us images from Giant's Causeway in Ireland. He notes the presence of more of those hexagonal shapes and surmises that this was also the site of a massive tree stump, but one that has sunken in and been eroded by the nearby sea. He balks at the idea from Wikipedia that the causeway was created by a volcanic eruption, stating that the idea that a volcanic eruption could create such a series of shapes, which have the hand of intelligent design on them, is as ludicrous as saying that a Ferrari can be constructed by an explosion at a Ferrari factory. Everybody knows what molten rock looks like when it flows out of a volcano and then cools. He shows us images of such instances and compares them to the structures that we're told are constructed in this manner. Now, one of the questions that one would and should be asking is this: what could turn a wooden tree stump via petrification into such a structure? Well, there is one event that I can think of that would do such a thing. The Great Deluge does not just belong to the Book of Two Religions. Most ancient cultures had stories about a massive flood that devastated the world. The one many of us are familiar with is the one from the first book of Moses, or as it is known today, the Book of Genesis. That would create the kind of pressure and sediment distribution needed to transform a wooden or biological structure into, for lack of a better word, stone. In 2016, the video, "There Are No Forests," sparked a lot of interest. So much so that some groups stated their intentions to use ground-penetrating radar to see if they could find any evidence of some sort of petrified root system underneath Devil's Tower. To my knowledge, they have not yet been allowed to do so. This one was out there, I'll admit, even for me. But to paraphrase Rod Serling, improbable? Perhaps. But let us hesitate to say impossible. Another question that one should immediately come to mind is this. If these are all remnants of giant world trees, then who or what the hell cut them down? That, however, is a question for another video. Thank you for your attention.